What is up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about So some of you probably already know about frequency conflict and the fundamentals of using an equalizer, but I figured as we're probably going to be diving into the mixing stage of the track that we're working on at the moment, I figured I'm going to take this opportunity to explain to those who may not know about frequency conflict a little bit about what it is and what to look out for. So the idea is that if you have two sounds playing at the same time, occupying the same frequency bands, the chances are your ears are going to mask out a large proportion of the sound and you're not going to be able to hear both of the sounds very audibly. And one way to combat that is to use an EQ to cut out the frequency band of the sound that you don't want to overpower the other sound. And I'm going to show you a quick demo of what I mean. So I've got some white noise loaded on a channel here, and I've got a little vocal recording that I've recorded myself speaking here. So I'm going to play the sequence, and you're not really going to be able to hear what I'm saying in the sample until I apply the EQ. Let's have a look. So I've got the sequence loaded over here. Let's just have a listen to it. So because the white noise is essentially covering every frequency band in the audible range, we're not able to hear what the vocal is saying until we actually remove the frequency band that the vocal is occupying from the white noise sample. So generally speaking, your vocals will cover a sort of wide proportion of the mid-range. So what I've done is I've put an EQ on and I've cut out almost all the mids of the white noise. So I've just got low frequencies and I've just got high frequencies left over. Now let's have another listen to this little sequence that we've made here. Frequency conflict. So you guys are probably thinking, like, what the hell does this actually mean in the real world environment? What does it actually mean? How does it apply to sounds and how does it apply to my track? Well, I'm going to show you guys a couple of sort of real world examples of how frequency conflict can be used to clean up the mix of your track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this white noise over a section of kick and bass, and then let's just mute all the other channels. So you can't really hear exactly what's going on in the low end, but when I start, let's say for example, apply an EQ onto the master channel, I'm going to do a low pass just on the master, just so I can kind of get a reference of what's happening in the low frequencies of the track. And you'll notice that the low end of the white noise is coming through and it's creating that extra little bit of rumble that kind of dirties up the bass sound, and you really don't want that. You really don't want any other elements to be interfering with the sound of your bass and your kick. You want those to kind of be as clean and prominent in the mix as possible. Let's say for example, add a high pass and cut out all the lows from the white noise, and then let's play our sound again with the EQ on the master channel. So it's subtle at this point, but you'll notice that the bass sound is sounding a lot more prominent and it's cutting through a lot cleaner, specifically the sort of more transient element of the sound. When we remove the EQ from the master channel and we listen to what everything sounds like together, we'll notice that it sounds a lot cleaner than it did without the EQ. So like I said, the effect is subtle, but it does help to clean up the overall mix of the sounds, and it helps to sort of create a little bit of space for each sound to sit separately in the mix. And a way to get this to kind of sound really effective is to use it to separate, for example, like your synth channels. Say, for example, like your squelches, you want really to have a lot of mid-range. You want your pads and stuff to have a lot of high frequency. You want your more like FM grindy type of more deeper sounds to obviously have quite a bit of like mid-lows and stuff like that. So you can use your EQ to actually carve out separate spaces for each of those sounds in the mix. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to solo a section here with my synths. So as I've been going through the project, I've kind of been loosely adding EQs to some of the channels that I kind of thought needed the EQs. And at this point, once I've got a bunch of the sounds and once I've got a more full track going, I'll go into the tracks and hone in the EQs a little bit more precisional. I'll look out for what frequencies are sort of strongest in each sound, and I'll sort of accentuate those in that channel or cut them in the other channels. So let's say, for example, let's have a look at this sound over here. So you'll notice with this sound, most of the sort of activity in the sound is happening around the sort of 600 hertz region. There's a lot of low end and there's a lot of high end. But with, say, for example, this sound over here, there's a lot of high end in that sound. So we can kind of use the two characteristics of each sounds to build a specific area in our frequency spectrum for those sounds. So going back to the first synth I was chatting about, this guy over here, because obviously it's taking up more space in the sort of 600 hertz region, let's say for example cut out or dip the frequencies at which we don't really need in that sound. So let's say for example put a high pass at the bottom here to about 200 hertz, and then let's say just dip the highs a bit like that. So because the fundamentals of this first synth sound aren't occupying the space at which we cut, we can use that conversely as the space that we use to place one of our other synth sounds. That way, filling up the frequency spectrum without having things overlap or clash and without creating any frequency conflict. So with the second synth, let's say for example, put a high pass and cut it, and then dip it about here, and leave the very highs to come through. So I like to break it up into groups and work on my EQ spaces in groups. Like for example with the synths, I'll do all of those first, make sure they all sound like they've got their own sort of space in the mix before I move on to then applying the same theory to the percussion and the kick and bass and all sorts of stuff like that. I just find it's a lot easier to break it up into smaller segments. That way you can sort of sit down one production session and just sort of EQ and mix your synths, and then maybe tomorrow when you've got fresh ears, come back and EQ and mix your percussions and stuff like that. So it's a much easier way to break it down into chunks by using groups and stuff like that. So let's have a quick look at moving on to our group synth channel, and then we'll probably call it a day, and you guys probably understand the fundamentals and be able to then apply that to the tracks that you guys are making. So with this channel, it's a little bit harder because we've got content from a couple of different sources, but bear in mind with the other synth sounds, we've already placed those in the spectrum. In terms of a method of, say, deduction, you're able to place the rest of the sounds around the space that you've already created, if that makes sense. So once you've got your more prominent sounds standing out and sort of cutting through in the mix, then you can kind of place everything else around those. I want a lot of the low end to come through on this sound. Don't want any highs. But then I also remembered that the first synth that we did had a lot of low end, but it was more leaning towards the mid-range. So maybe let's cut it like this, and let's see how these sounds work together. So like I said, well, I've said a few times actually in this video, it's a very, very subtle effect, but it definitely helps with the overall mix. When you start looking at like over 20 sort of multi-channel mixdowns, and each of those channels aren't specifically placed in the correct space, you get a lot of sort of overall noise that overlaps and comes through in the final mix. And EQ is definitely the way to sort of combat that and make everything sort of sit much nicer in the mix. And specifically when you're talking about frequency spectrum and kind of placing your sort of objects in the mix, EQ is definitely, in my opinion, the most important tool for the mixdown process. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel. Cool, so that's the idea of frequency conflict. I hope that helps you guys out. I'm going to do another couple of videos on EQing and a couple of techniques that I've picked up over the years, so definitely subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet and you want to hear more about EQs. If you want to support me and my channel, if you want to support me and what I do on my channel, head on over to my Patreon page and check out the different pledges I've got there. As always, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. See you guys next time.